The auditorium was packed. Giant screens displayed graphics and shocking images of the epidemic that had already devastated 3 continents. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, as the world's greatest scientists awaited a miracle solution. In the middle of the stage, unexpectedly, the name that appeared on the screen made many laugh mockingly: Dr. Michael Harris. The same young man who, months earlier, had been booed and called a fraud by that same audience. Now, before a skeptical audience, he took a deep breath, knowing he held in his hands something that could change the game. The mood was one of contempt and, at the same time, despair. Everyone wanted the cure, but no one wanted to believe it would come from him. Michael's first words were interrupted by derisive whispers and muffled chuckles. "This is the kid who talked about hybrid cells." "Ridiculous," muttered an Oxford professor, completely unconcerned about being overheard. But there was something different in Michael's gaze now. It wasn't the gaze of a young man seeking approval. It was the gaze of someone holding a truth that could decide between life and death. He lifted a heavy folder filled with notes and slammed it firmly on the table. The sound echoed through the room, forcing everyone to pay attention. The suspense was building. What did he have to show now? A projector began to display microscopic images of mutating cells. The audience leaned forward, even though many still turned up their noses. Michael explained how he had predicted the epidemic's advance months earlier, and how he had already modeled a possible antidote. The graphs showed the disease's progression, exactly as it was happening in the real world. "You ignored me when there was still time," he said, his voice choked but firm. A chill ran through the room. It was clear none of this was a coincidence. The question hanging in the air was brutal. Could this man everyone had humiliated really be humanity's last hope? As Michael spoke, an invisible tension spread. Some faces began to change expressions, from contempt to disbelief. White-haired scientists, Nobel laureates, heads of major universities, all faced with the possibility that they had made the most disastrous mistake of their careers. "If my study had been taken seriously, thousands of lives could have been saved," Michael continued, his voice thick with pain and indignation. The silence was now heavy, and even the most arrogant avoided looking at him. Outside the auditorium, sirens wailed. Chaos was already taking over the streets. Hospitals were collapsing, and desperate families huddled together searching for answers. The epidemic waited for no one, and there, in that room, the most undervalued man of all was the only one who seemed to have a real way to stop the catastrophe. Michael knew this, and with each passing second, the weight of his words increased. One of the professors who had ridiculed him most, Dr. Richard Coleman, tried to maintain his composure. But his face betrayed fear. He clearly remembered the day he had sarcastically interrupted Michael's presentation, calling his theory a youthful fantasy. Now, that same theory was the only thing that made sense in the face of global collapse. The suspense reached its peak, as each revelation Michael made seemed to dismantle a layer of the collective arrogance in the room. And then, suddenly, Michael stopped talking. He slowly closed his briefcase, looked at the audience, and uttered a sentence that made everyone's blood run cold. "You want a cure? Then you'll have to hear the truth you never wanted to accept." The silence was absolute.
Even breath seemed held.
There was no longer room for mockery, only the certainty that something profound and disturbing was about to be revealed. Outside, live footage showed hospitals overflowing, doctors collapsing from exhaustion, families crying as they lost loved ones. The urgency of the situation made everyone's hearts race. The tension inside the auditorium was so intense it felt like the air weighed tons. No one dared interrupt Michael now. The ignored scientist had absolute control of the room. He resumed speaking, but this time his voice didn't tremble. It was firm, cutting like a blade tearing through a veil of hypocrisy. Michael began to expose, with irrefutable evidence, how he had been systematically silenced for being young, black, and too bold for the standards of the academic elite. "You didn't reject my research because it lacked merit. You rejected it because it came from me." The shock was instantaneous. Faces went pale. No one could deny the truth that echoed like a punch to the gut. The final projected images showed a simulation, an experimental serum that attacked the very core of the viral mutation. The audience, now stunned, watched in absolute silence. Michael then held up a clear vial, the liquid glistening in the light. "Here's the antidote. But before we hand it over, You must face the weight of what you have done." The suspense was unbearable. The fate of the entire world now lay in the hands of a man who had been scorned, humiliated, and rejected. The broadcast camera zoomed in on Michael's face, capturing his unshed tears. Outside, crowds watched live, hoping for a salvation no one imagined would come from this young man who had once been the butt of ridicule. What he would say next could change not only the course of the epidemic, but also human history. And in that moment, everyone understood. There was no longer any escape from the coming judgment. Months before the epidemic reached its peak, Michael Harris had been summoned to present his research at one of the world's most important conferences, held in Boston. He arrived at the auditorium wearing a simple suit, without the expensive ties and shiny watches adorning the other scientists. As he prepared his slides, he could already feel the suspicious stares. Some whispered, others chuckled quietly, as if his presence there were a grotesque mistake. But Michael took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He knew his discovery could change medicine. He just didn't know he was about to be treated like an intruder. As he began to speak, describing how hybrid cells could be used to predict viral mutations, a muffled laugh echoed from the front row. It was Dr. Richard Coleman, a renowned researcher at the University of Cambridge. "You mean to tell me this kind of prediction comes from software you programmed yourself?" "How naive," he exclaimed, interrupting the presentation. The audience burst into laughter, and Michael felt the weight of embarrassment suffocate his chest. He tried to continue, but the collective laughter spread, crushing his confidence. "That's the problem with today's youth," a French scientist said, rolling her eyes. "They think they can reinvent centuries of research with a laptop." The words hit Michael like knives. He struggled to keep his voice steady, but each sentence was punctuated by sarcastic comments. The projector showed impressive simulations, but no one seemed to want to look seriously. It was as if the mere origin of his idea, coming from a young black man of humble origins, was reason enough to dismiss it all. Some in the audience even showed genuine curiosity, but were quickly silenced by the authoritarian tone of the academic leaders. "Let's be serious, Harris. If this were something relevant, you wouldn't be here alone, without the support of any major institution," another professor mocked. The audience applauded the comment as if it were a joke. Michael's heart was pounding, but he didn't give up. He continued explaining every detail, hoping that at least someone would listen. Inside, Michael struggled with an avalanche of emotions. Fear, anger, sadness, everything mingled. He knew the rejection wasn't just scientific, but personal. He'd felt it since the beginning of his career. Closed doors, cold interviews, condescending smiles. Now, before hundreds of experts, his pain was on display. Every laugh seemed to say, "You don't belong here." But there was also a flame within him, a determination that refused to be extinguished. When the conference ended, Michael left alone. While other researchers clinked glasses of wine, he walked the icy streets of Boston with tears in his eyes. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from indignation. He mentally replayed the data, the evidence he had presented. He knew he was right. But what good was being right if no one was willing to listen? The wind bit his face, and that night he promised himself he would not give up even if the whole world tried to silence him. The following days were even more brutal. Academic blogs began mocking his presentation, calling him a dreamy boy and an amateur scientist. An article in an influential journal quipped, "If the world's salvation depends on Harris's computational predictions, we're doomed." Michael read every word as if they were daggers stuck in his skin. The prejudice was no longer veiled. It was explicit, cruel, devastating. Back in his small lab in New Jersey, Michael locked himself away for weeks. He worked nonstop, sleeping only a few hours, trying to refine his research. The laughter and scorn still echoed in his mind, but this only motivated him to prove them wrong. He tirelessly tested cell cultures, and the results confirmed his predictions. The viral mutation he had described was already underway. But no one would listen to him. His emails were ignored. His calls were refused. One day, he tried to schedule a meeting with the same Dr. Coleman. "Don't waste my time, Harris. Go back to your science fiction experiments," was the cold reply he received. Michael hung up the phone, his heart breaking, but he didn't give up. He began discreetly publishing his reports in smaller research forums, hoping that somewhere someone would take his voice seriously. But the silence was deafening. The academic community had decided to ignore him. Meanwhile, rumors of a new disease began to surface. Small outbreaks in remote cities, news of overwhelmed hospitals, confused doctors, symptoms no one could explain. Michael watched TV and every detail matched his predictions. Fear began to grip him. He knew he didn't have much time. He tried again to send his reports to major institutions, but the response was always the same: silence. He wasn't being taken seriously. Weeks passed and the outbreaks became epidemics. Governments began to panic and the media spoke of a mysterious disease. Michael paced his lab, head in his hands, begging for someone to finally pay attention to his studies. But no one did. He was merely a shadow in science. The world was heading for collapse, and the key was in his hands, hidden, invisible, ignored. Deep within his soul, Michael felt the pain of rejection mixed with the responsibility of carrying a secret that could save millions. The hatred and prejudice that had isolated him could now cost the entire world dearly. The suspense was unbearable. How long would they ignore him? How many lives would have to be lost before someone realized that the scorned scientist was their only hope? Michael spent sleepless nights pacing his small laboratory. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to mock him. The constant hum of the equipment was his only companion. The silence of rejection was more deafening than any criticism. He stared at the test tubes and the graphs on his screen, all confirming what he already knew. The epidemic was progressing exactly as he had predicted. But there was no one to share the burden. The world outside laughed at him, while within him a storm of despair grew. Calls to colleagues were always met with the same coldness. "Sorry, Harris, I can't get involved with this," one would say. "Your name is tarnished in the community." Another. It was as if he'd been placed on an invisible blacklist. Doors were closed, contacts evaporated, and even those who had once shown sympathy now avoided his name. Michael had lost not only credibility, but also his sense of belonging. It was a silent, cruel exile without bars, but with walls high enough to imprison his soul. Loneliness began to turn into physical pain. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his mind wouldn't stop. Nightmares haunted him, always with the same images. The audience laughing, his sweaty face, the microphone falling from his hands. He would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He would walk to the mirror and see his red, sunken, almost unrecognizable eyes. He whispered to himself, "You're not wrong. You're not wrong." But no matter how many times he repeated himself, doubt and fear gnawed at his mind. News of the outbreaks appeared more and more frequently on television. Michael watched helplessly, yelling at the screen, pointing to graphs only he understood. "That's it. That's what I said," he yelled to himself as journalists spoke of a mysterious illness. The feeling of being invisible consumed him. It was as if he carried a ticking time bomb in his hands, begging to be heard, but no one listened. This weight crushed him little by little, leaving him in pieces inside. At times he thought about giving up, throwing all the papers in the trash, breaking the tubes, destroying the computer. He felt the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. But then he remembered images of hospitalized patients, children crying in hospital corridors, desperate doctors. These scenes were like flames that reignited his determination. "If I give up, they win. And the world loses," he repeated, wiping away the tears with his hands. Michael's family was also suffering. His mother, Evelyn, called every night worried.
"Son, you need to rest."
"You're killing yourself." He responded in short sentences, trying to hide his pain. He didn't want her to know how destroyed he was. But Evelyn could feel it in his tone of voice, in the heavy silence between his words. She herself had witnessed the prejudice against her son since he was a child. But now she saw that the humiliation had transformed into a monster that was slowly devouring him. The lab walls began to feel increasingly suffocating. Michael spent hours staring at the same graphs, redrawing hypotheses, correcting calculations. He sought validation that never came. It was like shouting into the void. Sometimes he would place a chair in the center of the lab and pretend he was in an auditorium, replaying his presentation alone, listening to the laughter echo in his mind. He would respond out loud as if debating with ghosts. Such was the extent of his loneliness. One rainy morning, Michael slumped over his desk and burst into tears. The sound of rain pounding against the windows mingled with his muffled sobs. He wrote in his notebook, "If I die tomorrow, maybe someone will read this and understand." It was the record of a man on the brink of collapse, but still holding the torch of hope. Even broken, he could not abandon his mission. The burden was too heavy, but it was all he had left. With each new headline, the world seemed to sink deeper. The epidemic had already reached major capitals, paralyzing airports, closing schools, and spreading panic. Michael knew the clock was ticking. The isolation wasn't just personal, it was global. While governments debated desperate measures, the solution remained locked inside his small laboratory. His loneliness was no longer just pain. It was also a crushing responsibility. Sometimes Michael received messages from strangers who had stumbled across his name on obscure forums. "Your calculations make sense," one anonymous student would say. "Keep going, don't stop," another wrote. They were small fragments of hope that arrived like drops in a desert, but they were soon accompanied by cruel comments. Charlatan, opportunist, attention seeker. The world seemed divided between mockery and ignorance. No one truly saw the man behind the research. Over time, Michael began to grow accustomed to his role as a ghost. He walked the streets as if invisible, observing the desperate people, unaware that he might hold the key to their salvation. The conversations in cafes, the newspapers on newsstands, the radio broadcasts, they all spoke of the same problem. But no one mentioned his name. It was as if his existence had been erased by the arrogance of the scientific elite, and this erasure was more painful than any insult. Deep down, his flame still burned. It was weak, almost extinguished, but it was there. Michael knew that suffering was part of his journey. Isolation destroyed him inside, but it also prepared him. Because he was certain of one thing. When the world was at its limit, they would finally have to look at him. And on that day, the ironic laughter would turn to absolute silence. Michael unexpectedly received an invitation to an international conference broadcast live to the entire world. The central theme would be the search for solutions to the epidemic. He believed for a brief moment that he would finally have a chance to be heard. He spent nights preparing slides, refining data, and rehearsing every word. His hope was that in the face of global chaos, no one could ignore such clear evidence. But in the back of his mind, a shadow of distrust lingered. Something about this sudden openness seemed too good to be true. On the day of the conference, the immense auditorium was illuminated by spotlights that transformed the stage into an arena. Michael climbed the steps with sweaty palms and a racing heart. He believed he would finally have an audience willing to listen. However, as soon as he began his presentation, he noticed exchanged glances, discreet smiles, and even cameras focused on him as if expecting something spectacular or ridiculous. The discomfort grew with each passing second. He didn't know he was about to be the target of a cruel ambush. As Michael spoke about viral mutation patterns, a deep voice interrupted him. It was Dr. Richard Coleman who took the microphone and, in front of everyone, accused him of using the global crisis for self-promotion. The words echoed like hammer blows. Michael tried to respond, but Coleman gave him no space. He displayed manipulated graphs deriding Michael's work as homebrew fantasy. The audience began to laugh and applaud the attacker. Michael's chest tightened as if crushed. Suddenly, a giant screen displayed a grotesque montage. Photos of Michael edited in a caricatured fashion, accompanied by phrases like the imaginary savior. Laughter filled the room. Michael looked around, stunned, unable to understand how something so cruel could be allowed at such a prestigious event. He felt his face burn, his hands tremble. His papers slipped off the table, falling scattered across the floor. The audience applauded as if they were part of a show. It was pure calculated humiliation. Michael tried to catch his breath. He picked up one of the papers and showed real data, precise graphs. But every word was drowned out by laughter and ironic comments. Look, he even brought drawings to prove his theory. A French scientist mocked, drawing applause. The pain was unbearable. It wasn't just his research being destroyed. It was his dignity, his identity, his very existence being crushed before the world's cameras. At the height of his humiliation, someone in the audience shouted, "Go back to your ghetto, Harris. This is no place for you." The impact of those words pierced his chest like a blade. For a moment he froze. The prejudice was no longer disguised. It was raw, brutal, and explicit, and no one intervened. No organizer took the stage to defend his integrity. The complicit silence of the academic elite felt crueler than any direct attack. Michael dropped his papers and looked at the audience with unshed tears. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. "You don't understand. This disease won't wait. But his words were drowned out by more laughter. The sound echoed in his ears like thunder. This wasn't just a refusal. It was the public execution of his credibility. With each laugh, he felt a piece of his soul being ripped away. The collective contempt crushed him irreversibly. The cameras broadcast live to millions of people. And what the world saw wasn't a scientist making a revolutionary discovery. What they saw was a young black man being ridiculed, humiliated, and dehumanized before everyone's eyes. The cruelty was captured in high definition, as if it were entertainment. Michael knew that after that day, his image would be tarnished forever. Prejudice had won, and the world had watched in silence. When the performance ended, Michael walked off the stage alone. The hallway seemed endless, the sound of laughter still echoing behind him. In the dressing room, he threw his papers on the table and stared at himself in the mirror. His reflection trembled, blurred by tears. He whispered, "They destroyed me." The weight of that sentence seemed to crush his soul. For the first time, he felt there might be no going back. Maybe his voice had been erased forever. Outside, journalists waited, but not to hear his version of events. They simply wanted to capture his defeat. Cameras flashed as cruel questions surrounded him.
How does it feel to be refuted in public?
Don't you think you deceived people? Why do you insist on something that has no scientific basis? Michael walked through the crowd in silence, each question like a knife. There was no room for defense. The verdict was already in. He was the charlatan of science. That night, social media exploded. Videos of her humiliation were shared thousands of times with sarcastic captions. Memes mocking her dejected expression circulated around the world. Hashtags like lying scientist and showed a Harris spread like wildfire. Michael, alone in his dark room, scrolled through his phone screen with teary eyes. He watched himself being globally ridiculed, powerless to erase the stain he now bore. In the back of the room, the television showed hospitals collapsing. Children on stretchers, exhausted doctors, desperate families. The same scenario he had predicted now in real time. And as the world descended into chaos, the man who could have offered a solution had been crushed by arrogance and prejudice. Michael closed his eyes and whispered, "They don't know what they've done." The injustice had reached its peak, but the suspense was only just beginning. The epidemic exploded with relentless force. Entire cities were quarantined, planes abandoned on runways, hospitals converted into makeshift morgues. The smell of death permeated the streets and fear dominated every gaze. Governments declared states of emergency, but there was no plan capable of containing the disease's spread. The world seemed to be watching the end unfold in slow motion. And amidst this apocalyptic scenario, the only man who had foreseen it all was hidden in his laboratory, drowning in silence and pain. Michael watched the television broadcasts, his hand covering his mouth to hold back sobs, children coughing up blood, desperate mothers begging for help, doctors collapsing from exhaustion. Everything he'd seen in his calculations now materialized before the cameras. Helplessness crushed him. He held a possible cure in his hands, but the world had decided to dismiss it. It was like holding the key to a locked door while millions died on the other side. A phone call broke the silence. It was a representative from a major pharmaceutical company. For a moment, Michael thought they'd finally recognized his worth, but the offer was a punch in the gut. They wanted to buy his data for a paltry sum, demanding he sign a confidentiality agreement. The company wanted to steal his discovery and erase his name from history. Michael refused, but the threat came soon after. "If you don't cooperate, we'll destroy any chance of your research seeing the light of day." The attacks intensified. Television reports branded him a conspiracy theorist. Headlines called him an opportunist who profited from panic. Online groups began attacking him, spreading the word that he had created the disease himself to sell a cure. Michael read it all with burning eyes, feeling his sanity slipping away. It was a global lynching, fueled by the arrogance of those afraid to admit they had mocked the right man. The knock on the door came on a rainy dawn. Men in ties, sent by the same pharmaceutical company, entered without permission and ransacked his laboratory. Michael protested but was pushed against the wall. Computers, notebooks, samples, everything was taken. He knelt on the floor, staring blankly into space. It was as if his soul had been ripped out along with his research. Despair took over. The world was dying, and the cure had been stolen from the hands of its creator. Michael ran to the police but was met with indifference. "You need concrete evidence," they said, without even reporting the incident. To them, he was just a discredited scientist seeking attention. As he left the police station, he felt their gazes laden with contempt. He was a marked man condemned to eternal discredit. The injustice was so suffocating he could barely breathe. The entire system seemed conspiring to silence him. Meanwhile, the streets of New York were turning into hell. Incessant sirens, bodies piled up in black bags, families begging for non-existent vaccines. The city that never slept was now kneeling before death. Michael walked amidst the chaos, invisible, feeling the weight of every desperate gaze. He knew he could change this fate, but he had been reduced to a voiceless ghost. The final straw came when his mother, Evelyn, called in tears. A neighbor had been infected and there were no beds available at the hospital. Evelyn sobbed, begging for help. Michael broke down. The tragedy was now knocking on his door. It was no longer just a statistic, no longer just a graph on his screen. It was the lives of people close to him, those he loved. The pain was unbearable. He screamed, pounding the wall until his fists bled. The climax of injustice had arrived. That night he wrote in his diary, "If this is the end, let the world know. I tried. I warned. But they silenced me." The words trembled on the paper, stained with tears. Michael was on the verge of giving up. His faith in the world had shattered. The only reason to carry on was the faint flame that insisted on burning within him. But even that light seemed about to go out. Television cameras showed real-time chaos. Panicked politicians, looted markets, hastily erected military hospitals. The world was falling apart. And ironically, amidst the rubble of civilization, a solution existed. But prejudice and arrogance had buried the only voice that could save millions. The climax of tragedy was also the climax of human hypocrisy. Michael looked at the jar hidden deep in his drawer. The sample of the experimental serum was still there, intact like a last shred of hope. He held it with trembling hands, staring at the liquid reflecting the dim light of the lamp. Here was the cure, the salvation, but there was also the memory of his pain, his humiliation, his invisibility. The dilemma was unbearable. Surrender to the world that had scorned him or let them taste the price of arrogance. In that instant, Michael realized he had reached the darkest point of his journey. The world was collapsing, he was in pieces, and the truth was locked in his hands. It was the absolute climax. Humanity on one side, his pain on the other. The suspense was unbearable. The next step would define not only his fate, but the fate of all. The chaos in the streets had reached an unbearable level. Reporters broadcast images of collapsed hospitals, people begging for help, world leaders without answers. Then one gray morning, something unexpected happened. A confidential document was leaked to the press. It was Michael Harris's original reports with dates, calculations, and predictions that perfectly matched the epidemic's evolution. His name was plastered across every page. The truth, stifled for months, emerged like a cry impossible to ignore. Social media exploded. Hashtags that once mocked now turned into chants. Listen to Harris and. The ignored scientist videos of his humiliating performance resurfaced, but this time accompanied by outrage. "They laughed at a man who could have saved us." Thousands of comments said. The world was beginning to realize the monstrous injustice committed. And for the first time, Michael was seen not as a charlatan but as a victim of brutal prejudice. The biggest shock came when independent laboratories tested his calculations. Within days, they publicly confirmed Michael's formula contained the basis for a real antidote. The news spread like wildfire. TV channels prominently displayed his photo. Headlines screamed, "The ignored scientist was right." That same face that had been the butt of jokes now became a symbol of hope. But for Michael, there was no glory in that moment. Only pain. In the Cambridge University auditorium where Michael had been humiliated, a press conference was hastily called. Renowned scientists, including Richard Coleman, appeared before the cameras with ashen faces. They admitted that they had dismissed Harris's research without serious analysis. Their arrogance now burned them in public. The world watched live the forced repentance of the scientific elite. The heavy silence of the broadcast was crueler than any scream. "Not only did we fail to recognize your research," Coleman confessed, his voice trembling, "but we also treated you with disrespect and prejudice." The public reacted angrily. Protest began in front of the university. Signs displayed slogans such as, "You laughed while we died and racism kills." The turnaround wasn't just scientific, it was moral. The whole world now pointed the finger at those who had crushed a man's voice because of the color of his skin. Michael, locked in his small laboratory, watched it all on television. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just cried, not with joy but with accumulated pain. Now they believe. But at what cost? He murmured, holding the serum vial with trembling hands. The world's redemption came too late for thousands of families. The weight of the tragedy was unbearable. The truth had won, but the price was too high. Then a knock echoed at the door. Representatives from the World Health Organization entered, flanked by cameras. Michael froze. They stared at him with a respect they had never before shown him. "Dr. Harris, the world needs you. The antidote you created could save millions." He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling each word like a blade and a cure at the same time. Finally, they were asking for help. But now the decision was in his hands. Outside, crowds chanted his name. The same people who had ignored him now called him a hero. Headlines extolled his genius, politicians rushed to issue public apologies. The entire world knelt before the man who had once been reduced to ridicule. The irony was suffocating. Michael, the ignored scientist, was now humanity's last hope. Coleman tried to visit him in person. The man who had humiliated him before the world now trembled as he knocked on his door. "Michael, I was wrong. Forgive me." The words came out brokenly, poisoned by shame. Michael stared at him silently, his eyes filled with pain and anger. The man who had destroyed him now begged for redemption. It was a turning point, where the roles were completely reversed. The plot twist had reached its climax. The same system that had tried to erase him now depended on him for survival. Michael held in his hands not only the cure, but also the chance to confront the ghosts that had haunted him. Every second was charged with suspense. Would he deliver salvation? Or would he let the world experience the weight of his own arrogance? The dilemma was brutal, human, visceral. Crowds outside chanted his name as if he were a deity. Cameras broadcast his face in real time, and millions awaited his decision. The one who had been most humiliated was now the most needed. The turnaround was not just a personal victory. It was a cruel mirror held up to humanity. Racism and arrogance had nearly cost the entire world. Now everyone waited, suspended in uncertainty. What would Michael do? Deep down, he knew the power he wielded wasn't just scientific. It was moral. The reversal was complete. The ignored man now decided the fate of humanity. And all who had laughed, all who had mocked, all who had humiliated him were on their knees, begging for the hand they had once rejected. Michael stood silently before the cameras, clutching the small vial of antidote. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. It was as if time had stopped. Outside, crowds waited. On the other side of the screen, millions watched with teary eyes. He felt the weight of each life on his shoulders. Inside, he struggled with a mixture of resentment and compassion. After all, those now begging for help were the same ones who had publicly destroyed him. He took a deep breath and began to speak. His voice was firm but charged with emotion. "You called me a liar. You laughed at me. You humiliated me before the world. You didn't just reject my knowledge. You rejected me. You rejected my existence." The silence was absolute. Each word cut like a knife. There was no denying the truth. The attackers were exposed before the entire world. Michael held up the vial before the cameras. "Here is hope. Here is the result of nights of suffering, tears, and loneliness. I didn't do this for glory. I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because I believed lives could be saved." A tear ran down his face. The contrast was stark. The humiliated man was now the embodiment of dignity. The WHO representatives approached, asking for the formula. Michael hesitated for what seemed like an eternity. Then he handed them the vial. "I will not let millions die because of the hatred of a few. But know this, humanity nearly destroyed itself not because of disease, but because of prejudice." The impact of the sentence echoed around the world. It was more than science. It was a moral judgment. The crowd erupted in applause and tears. Headlines read, "The ignored scientist saves the world," but Michael didn't smile. There was no victory in his heart, only aching relief. He knew thousands had already died because of the arrogance that silenced him. Healing came too late for many. The glory was empty. The wound remained open. Richard Coleman, his face drenched in shame, tried to speak again. But Michael cut him off. I don't need your apologies. I need you to change. I need no young person to ever again be silenced because of the color of their skin, their family's humble origins, or the audacity to think differently. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. It was stronger than any apology. The following days transformed Michael into a global symbol. Murals bearing his image appeared in several cities. Schools taught his story as a lesson, but he wasn't seeking statues or tributes. What he wanted was justice for those who came before him and were erased. He wanted to ensure that future generations wouldn't go through the same hell he had. This was his true victory. In a historic interview, Michael delivered a clear message. The epidemic has shown that the most dangerous virus isn't biological. It's prejudice. It's racism. It kills in silence, it closes doors, it silences voices. And it almost destroyed the entire world. His words spread across the planet, etched in the minds of millions. They were indelible. His mother, Evelyn, hugged him tearfully when he returned home. I knew you could do it, son. Even when the whole world doubted, I knew. Michael wept in her arms, finally allowing the armor of pain to fall away. In that embrace, there was redemption. Not redemption for humanity, but for the boy who grew up being told he would never be enough. The attackers faced public judgment. Their careers were tarnished, their reputations ruined. But for Michael, none of that mattered. The true triumph lay in each life saved by the antidote, each child who breathed a sigh of relief, each mother who smiled at seeing her son recover, each family reunited. That was what truly mattered. Over time, the world began to rebuild, but the scar remained. Michael Harris's name would be remembered not only as the scientist who saved humanity, but as the man who exposed history's oldest and most silent virus, racism. His story was more than science. It was a warning, a mirror, a cry that no voice could ever again be silenced because of skin color. In his final live speech, Michael looked directly into the camera. His gaze was deep, intense, almost hypnotic. If you have learned anything from this tragedy, let it be this: underestimate no one. Ridicule no one. For from the voice you despise may come salvation, and from cruel laughter may be born eternal shame. The world fell silent. It was the perfect ending to a story that would never be forgotten. How many voices have been silenced by prejudice? How many talents have been overlooked just because of their skin color? This story is not just about Michael Harris. It's about all those who, even though they have the key to changing the world, are rejected because of racism. Don't let this keep happening. Share this story, report injustices, and never ever underestimate someone for what they appear to be. Because salvation may lie precisely in the voice that the world insists on silencing.